Philo Collins, okay, this is a really important topic, and you're an attorney here in the district. You've been
Since
here
1978.
Wow, so that's impressive. So you've seen this building behind us before many times.
Yes, the Capitol.
Capitol Dome. And so the question has to do with an idea that you have that could benefit, you feel, the district citizens right now that we need to know about.
Right.
But it goes back to the inception of the District of Columbia, 1776, in fact.
Right, it goes back to the
Declaration of Independence.
Yeah. Right. And then after that, in July, was the Declaration of Independence. In August, the Maryland legislature passed the Declaration of Rights of Maryland, which in 1790, Maryland gave the land, which is now the District of Columbia, to the federal government. And in return, they required that the Maryland laws be followed, which included the Declaration of Rights.
What is suffrage about?
Suffrage is the right to vote for a representative. So the Declaration of Rights of Maryland, which became the D.C. Declaration of Rights, says that everyone, paragraph 5 says every man, and now includes women, has the right of suffrage, the right to vote for a representative in the legislature. And our legislature, according to the Constitution in Article 1, is the Congress of the United States. We have no representatives there. We haven't had any the whole time. But I think we should have, under the Maryland and now District of Columbia Declaration of Rights, paragraph 5. That has never been changed. The Maryland Declaration of Rights, which became the District Declaration of Rights, has been used in many lawsuits for various purposes. There's other provisions in it that have led to lawsuits and court decisions, so that it is an actual ongoing legal entity that we have that simply hasn't been enforced as to voting rights, which needs to happen. Now, there have been other laws which haven't been followed in court for a long time, such as the Alien Tort Claims Act. It was passed in 1790, but it was not really brought up into cases until the 1960s. And some of the civil rights laws after the Civil War were not really followed until the 50s and 60s as well.
So obviously,
the fact that it's an old law doesn't mean it's not enforced. It's like if they don't enforce the speeding laws, it doesn't mean they don't exist. They can. What we need to do is enforce it. The District of Columbia should, the Attorney General and the district should make sure that we can harmonize our laws. In this case, it would have to be with Maryland, I believe, because Maryland required that the law be applied, and therefore we would have to vote with Maryland, I believe, under this law. Now, there could be an argument that Maryland would have to have voting rights itself. So we would have senators. The issue comes up with senators. The district is large enough to have one representative in Congress at this time.
So the delegate that we have right now, Eleanor Holmes
ought to
Norton,
be a House of Representative member.
She would probably agree with that.
Should be voting. She could. Now there is an idea that districts should have statehood. Now that's an excellent idea. Unfortunately, it hasn't been able to get passed in Congress. Now, to have statehood, they would have to have the House and the Senate just approve D.C. as a state. It's fairly simple that way. Now, there have been constitutional amendments. In 1960, the D.C. was given the right to have 3 electors for the President of the United States in the voting. One
as
for
in the
president,
electoral college.
In the electoral college for president only, but that didn't give us a vote in the Congress. In 1978, there was a constitutional amendment which would have given us a representative and 2 senators, but that didn't pass. It didn't become a constitutional amendment. But to become a state would actually take less than that. We would only have to have House of Representatives and the Senate pass.
What do you think the chances are that we'll actually become a state, that this would happen?
Well, I don't know. It's very fluid now with, obviously the Republicans are totally in charge of the government, and they're against that because the D.C. is a Democratic voting area at this time. Although you never know, that could change, but it seems unlikely. But there could be a large change in the representatives in Congress to become a state. This proposal that I have has nothing to do with any legislation or becoming a state. It says we already have the right to vote. We just haven't implemented it. We haven't fought for our rights in court on this approach of using the Declaration of Rights of 1776 of Maryland, which became the D.C. Declaration of Rights.
So you're saying that we haven't taken full advantage of what we already have on the books that could be more of a powerful tool for doing what?
Right. What we'd have to do, though, is cooperate with Maryland, I believe. I don't think that we could say that we're a state ourselves. We have Maryland required that their law be applied to the district. The Organic Act of 1801 agreed with that and said that the law of Maryland applies, so that the Declaration of Rights of D.C. Is the Declaration of Rights of Maryland of 1776 by act of Congress, and which means that Congress needs to follow through with that. They could simply accept that we have the right to have a representative there. We would now be large enough to be a district. Back in 1801, we were not large enough. The Constitution said you need 30,000 people in the original House of Representatives. We only had like 10 or 12,000 people, so we weren't big enough to be a representative district then. But we could have voted with Maryland under the Declaration of Rights, and so we would have vote for representative with them, and our votes would be counted for their member of the House.
So it would take a collaboration between us and
well.
Maryland to
either a
mass.
collaboration or a court order. Now, courts have ordered things in voting rights, particularly with like gerrymandering, one person, one right to vote. So I think that it's an avenue which should be explored. I'm not saying that it will win in the courts, but I believe it should win. I believe that the law is on our side. Whether or not having a law on your side means that the courts will agree and go forward with that, I don't know. I mean, there's been a lot of court cases that people could say, well, the court made a bad decision, like Plessy versus Ferguson, where the Constitution in the 14th Amendment said that all people Americans shall be entitled to equal protection of the laws. The 13th Amendment had ended slavery to make the slaves American citizens as full as anyone else. And then the 14th Amendment said equal protection, but then in Plessy versus Ferguson, they were separate but equal. And then it took up until 1950s before they Brown versus Board of Education, where they said separate is not equal. You have to be equal to be equal. There's nothing in the Constitution that said separate to be equal. In this case, we have a law that says that we have the right to suffrage as in the District of Columbia through the Maryland law, which became the district law, but it simply hasn't been enforced. Like the 14th Amendment wasn't really enforced up after Plessy versus Ferguson decision until Thurgood Marshall and other people managed to get the Supreme Court to reverse that decision and say, look, equal is equal and not separate but equal. In this case, we are a separate entity, but we are equal as American citizens, and we have a right to vote under the law which exists now if we simply go and enforce it.
Now, I assume that Eleanor Holmes Norton, who has been our delegate for so many terms, is aware of this strategy. Have you mentioned this to her at all, or you had a chance to talk to her?
I have talked to her briefly. I'm not sure I mentioned this. I need to do that.
Okay. So how would that benefit us, do you think, in the short term, if we were able to push towards this implementation of strategy as you've
the term, I don't know how long this would take to go through. If it went through the courts, it would probably take several years. If it went through political, you could have dual track. You could try to reach an agreement with Maryland and with the Congress to allow this, which, they could say, yes, thanks for pointing this out to us. We realize you're correct. We're going to implement it. We're good people of good faith. We want to apply the law in good faith, and we will. Or they could say, look, it hasn't happened in 200 years. Why should it happen now? And we have to go through the courts, and that could take several years.
Okay. Well, we're standing on Second and East Capitol, and we have Mr. Philo Collins. You're sometimes known as Phil Collins, but you're distinguishing yourself.
There's too many Phil Collinses.
And you're not much of a singer, though, right?
Right. It's just a nickname. It's Philip, and then I could be Phil or Philo. So.
Well, I think you've got an interesting
Philo
approach.
Farnsworth invented television.
Oh, really? Well,
he was from Oklahoma.
Oh, well, that makes it a good name, right?
Right.
Well, this is new TV. We're on the internet, so to speak. Okay. So you've got an initiative.
Thank you, Todd.
You've got an initiative, and what do you feel that people should do in order to help you see this completed?
Well, yeah, we need to bring it forward to Eleanor Holmes Norton, as you mentioned, our delegate, who should be a House of Representative member in full, with full voting rights for the district. We also need to work on the Senate side of it, which would mean either we vote for Maryland senators, or we try to argue that we should have our own senators. The problem with that is they would say that statehood, and Congress has to vote on that. Now the thing is, if we have, under my approach, what I'm saying here with the Declaration of Rights of D.C. from Maryland, we would have votes in Congress without being a state. It would being basically say that there was a reservation of rights to Maryland to have us vote with them for representatives in Congress. But our representatives could vote for statehood just like other representatives around the country would have to vote for statehood. DC can't vote unilaterally to say that we are now a state. Congress has to accept that. But if we had representatives in Congress, they could vote for full statehood at that point.
Do you think that's going to happen realistically within the next few years?
I don't know, but I know that it should happen. The thing is, you don't. When they were trying to get Brown versus Board of Education, they didn't know that they would win. They knew that they should win. They knew that they had right on their side. They didn't know that they had votes in the Supreme Court on their side. In fact, in the first, Brown versus Board of Education was argued twice. In the play Thurgood, about Thurgood Marshall, who was the lead counsel, he said that he felt with the first argument that Chief Justice Vinson was against them, that they were going to uphold Plessy versus Ferguson and say that they didn't have any equal rights. They only had separate equal rights. Well, what happened was Vinson died, and then we had Chief Justice Warren. Earl Warren became the Chief Justice, and he took a different tack, and they had a basically unanimous decision that separate but equal is not good enough for schooling, and then that it was applied to other areas as well, such as it was into the 60s before they had the Loving decision, where the right to marry, states could not prohibit people from marrying. So it may take
people
a
of
while.
all races.
People of all races, right? Well, and now we're looking at genders as well, which has already been passed by the Supreme Court. So we don't know how long it'll take, but we know that we need to head in that direction and work that way, because the right is on our side.
Okay, well, with that, thank you for sharing your information. You'll have more ideas, stimulations coming up in the near future, and if people want to react, or they have their ideas of their own that they'd like to talk about as far as the laws or how they should be implemented, then they can connect with us, right?
Yeah, sure.
All right, see you soon.
You.
Bye-bye. Okay. All right, yeah, sure.